Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and Vinyl World. Today, we're going to talk about albums that are not overrated. So, you always hear about people talk about certain classic albums that are great, and great record, man. Oh, awesome album. And there's a lot of albums out there that I can consider maybe overrated. And I was going to do originally a show about that, but I think since I don't own a lot of those that I think are overrated, I decided to do albums that are not overrated. And I was gonna do it so it wasn't such obvious choices. I'm obviously Dark Side of the Moon, Rumors from Fleetwood Mac. Those are awesome albums. They are not overrated, but I didn't want to go over albums like that. I would do it for more bands that I am into, and albums that I own myself. Thought I owned Rumors, but turns out I don't have a copy of it right now currently. So, anyway, let's get started. First one is by Judas Priest. And it was really tough for me to pick one because I was originally going to pick British Steel, but I ended up going with Screamin' for Vengeance. British Steel to me is very good top to bottom album, and it's one of two albums you should probably own if you're a fan of theirs. But I think British Steel still comparably has that sound to Hellbent for Leather, Stained Class. So to me, it's sort of the end of that era, even though it came out after Unleashed in the East. But by the time they got to Screaming for Vengeance, they sort of had it perfected, that Priest sound. Everything is perfect on here. The production, performances, the songwriting. Some of their biggest hits are on here. The Hellion, Riding on the Wind, Screaming for Vengeance, You've Got Another Thing Coming. This is not, even though this was their first platinum album, I believe, it's still not, they haven't moved into that pop metal world yet, or more commercial sound. This is still like blisteringly heavy. And this is, to me, this is when you think of Judas Priest, this is as heavy as it comes for them. Like, albums like British Steel, they were heavy, but when you listen back to them, they weren't real heavy compared to how they sounded live. This album really captures all of that, I believe. Next one I have is Cheap Trick, Heaven Tonight. And some of these albums that I'm going to go over are not even the favorite album from the artists. But this album, top to bottom, to me, is when someone asks, what does Cheap Trick sound like? It definitely is this album. And I think everything from the production, the songwriting, the vocals, this is a perfect album from top to bottom. Starts off with Surrender. Ends with Eau Claire. And, it has California Man, Top of the World, Arvita Zen, High Roller. Even the not well-known songs on here are just as good as the well-known songs. So, again, I think if you're not a fan of Cheap Trick, you're just a fan of rock and roll in general, you should own this album. It's definitely not overrated. Also, I forgot to mention, I'm just going to do studio albums. I'm not going to bring in live albums into the not overrated category, because obviously everybody needs to own At Budokan too, as well as the live album from this next artist. So I'm going to pick Kiss Destroyer. Now, you either love or hate Kiss, but I think there's a middle ground for people that are just a fan of hard rock and metal. There's two albums I think everybody should own, Destroyer and Kiss Alive, obviously. But Destroyer is the studio album that's Kiss at its best. I think the song Detroit Rock City, the studio version, if you ask what does Kiss sound like, that is what Kiss sounds like. This is the first one produced by Bob Ezrin, and if you listen to their first three studio albums, this is their fourth studio album, you could just tell this is leaps and bounds above those. The production, songwriting, performances, everything about it is great from top to bottom. And like I said, some of their biggest hits on here: Detroit Rock City, God of Thunder, Shout It Out Loud, Beth, of course, is on here. But definitely get that. Oh, I just wanted to point out I was going to do CDs first and then move on to the albums I have. Next one is by the band Toto. This is Toto 4, and obviously it's their fourth album. They won a lot of Grammys for this, and I could see why. It had a few big hits on it. Africa, which is almost a bigger hit now than then, and Rosanna. Again, I don't know if this is my favorite album by then. The first album, I think, maybe even I like better than this one. But when someone mentions Toto, this is probably the album they're going to bring up because it was such a big seller and had so many Grammy Awards. But it is definitely not overrated. I mean, every song on here is great. It's a wide variety of songs on here. Not too much of the prog or jazz influence on this album, but definitely go from rock to almost adult contemporary, soft rock, but definitely an album you should own if you're a fan of even I don't want to say classic rock because there's bits of that in here, but definitely one of the best albums of the 80s, I would say. Moving on, Jimi Hendrix Experience. It's their first album, Are You Experienced? Again, there's other Jimi Hendrix albums that people may prefer. I personally think Electric Ladyland may be a little overrated. To me, this is more of the Hendrix I prefer. And every song on here is killer. This edition has all of the B-sides and singles also. There's 17 tracks on here. I'm assuming that only the first 11 are on here. Track 12 starts with Stone Free on here, which I don't think was on the original album. But, you know, this is the album that changed the world for rock guitar. Hendrix, one of the greats of all time. Probably one of two of the most influential players of all time. And this is where it all started. And the album is just as good as everyone remembers it and says. Next up is Frank Zappa, Apostrophe. Now, again, this is another artist where he has many eras. And there could be albums you may love from different eras. Even, this is not my favorite Frank Zappa album, actually. And I was going to pick Hot Rats instead of this one. I decided to go to this one because this is probably his most well-known album, maybe. It was his first gold album, I believe. And when you look at the track listing, it sort of gives a good sample of what Frank's about. From Don't Eat the Yellow Snow to Father Oblivion to Apostrophe, which is an instrumental. I think this is a great album from start to finish. You know, it's definitely one of his most highly acclaimed albums, and I don't think it's overrated. It's just as good as anything in his catalog. I didn't want to include Hot Rats because I think this one's a little bit more accessible for people who maybe are starting with Frank Zappa. This is definitely a great starting album if you're going to listen to Frank Zappa. Next up is a band called King's X. And this is pretty much their most highly acclaimed album. Their second album, Gretchen Grows to Nebraska. Now, for years, I thought this album was overrated. I was a big fan of their first album. When this album came out, of course, I liked it, but I didn't think it was as great as everyone talked about. And for years later, everyone was talked about Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, blah, 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 blah. I liked a lot of the songs on here, but a lot of them didn't grab me as they did later on. So in the last, I say, 10 years or so, I definitely see what everyone's talking about in this album. It's definitely a great album from top to bottom. I also think this is their most Beatlesque album. So here's the cover. If you definitely see this album, pick it up. Next album I'm going to go with is by Rush, Moving Pictures. Again, definitely not overrated. This album is great from start to finish. They have other albums which could have been in here. 2112, Vital Signs, not Vital Signs. The one before this, it's slipping my mind right now. But I feel this is the one that you should start with if you're a Rush think about getting into Rush, it's definitely not overrated. It's a great album. The first side alone, Tom Sawyer, Red Bar Cheddar, YYZ, Limelight. I mean, four of their best well-known songs, and it's on one side of their album, so I would say definitely not overrated. Next, I'm going to go with a band called Montrose, which is Sammy Hagar's first band. Now, this is not an album that was a hit at the time. In fact, it wasn't until many years later that this album even went gold. I think it might be platinum by now. But it's sort of listed as the prototype for the Van Halen type band. Singer, guitar player, guitar hero, bass player, drummer, four-piece. And this album is killer from start to finish. Bad Motor Scooter, Rock the Nation, Space Station Number 5, Make It Last, Rock Candy. So these are some of the first songs that Sammy Hagar wrote, and they're some of his best of his career still. And this is one of those albums that everybody talks about as being a great album, whether they believe it or not, I don't know, but this one truly is not overrated. Next up, I'm going to go with Alice Cooper, Killer. Now, here's another album that for years I kind of thought was overrated, where I thought either Love It to Death or Welcome to My Nightmare were better albums overall. Again, this is probably not my favorite album from him, but after listening to it more recently since getting it on vinyl, I realize now how great this album is. And it's just really dark. And it has some of his best songs, I think, that people may not know. You Drive Me Nervous, Yeah Yeah, the song Killer itself. So, and people have always talked about how this is their favorite Alice Cooper album, but I didn't really get it at the time, but now I see that this is definitely not overrated. Next one is by a band that I think has two albums that everyone says are great, or their best album. This one and In Rock. Now, I've listened to In Rock and this one back and forth lots of times, and I could see where people would pick In Rock, but to me, this album is just the next level as far as being an album that's not overrated. It's perfect from start to finish. Highway Star, Maybe I'm a Leo, Pictures of Home, Never Before, Smoke on the Water, Lazy, and Space Truckin'. To me, this album, top to bottom, is just perfect, really. The production, the performances, the songs. It's definitely an album you have to own if you're classic rock fan, hard rock fan, metal fan of guitar players. This isn't actually a first UK pressing. It's got those UK pressings always had those real shiny covers. And I got this for 50 cents at a yard sale. I couldn't believe it. And In Rock, too. A UK pressing from the same guy. Unbelievable. Next up is Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. Again, this may not be my favorite album from them. I think either the first or second album, first one, or Killers. But when you listen to this album top to bottom, it's just a classic heavy metal album. And if you're not that big of a Maiden fan, I still feel that you should own this album if you're a hard rock or metal fan. I think every song is great on here except Gangland. It's probably the one that maybe should have been left off instead of... there was another song called, I think, King of Twilight that was a B-side. Should have been on here instead, but everything from Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, Hallowed Be Thy Name, probably their not biggest song, but biggest concert song. So definitely have to own that. Next up was kind of hard for me to pick a Zeppelin album because all their albums are classic from start to finish. And usually people pick Led Zeppelin 4 or Led Zeppelin 2. Some people pick Physical Graffiti. But I'm going to pick Led Zeppelin 2. I just think that this album is start to finish brilliant. It still has that rough edge that they had on their first album. Still very bluesy on here, but also delving into like the more of the better songwriting. And I don't think any Zeppelin album is overrated. They're all essential. They're all great. They're all brilliant. Kind of like the Beatles, I would say. So every album, I just picked Zeppelin too because this was the one that I listened to the most back then. So let me know what you think. Next one is another band too, Queen. I could have picked any number of Queen albums on here that aren't overrated, but this one definitely is not overrated. I feel like this one really represents what Queen is all about. There's all different types of songs on here. From everything from "We Will Rock You," "We Are the Champions" to "Sheer Heart Attack." "It's Late," which sort of is a big epic prog influence song. Not too much prog on here, but you know, the songwriting's great. "Sleeping on the Sidewalk," I think is sung by Brian May. "Mr. Melancholy Blues," "My Melancholy Blues," that was sung by Freddie. I think it's just piano, and it has his like Broadway side, but you know, people talk about this as a great album, but it's definitely not overrated. Next up, a lot of people think, I guess this is a handful of his albums that are considered his best or great, essential albums. But I think this one really, from a songwriting perspective, is really great. It's "Darkness on the Edge of Town." Probably my favorite studio album from him. I like a lot of his albums, but I would say this one's probably my favorite. To me, this represents what everything Bruce is about, along with "Born to Run." I think "Born to Run" is certainly the more highly acclaimed one, probably. That one I think maybe is a little more overrated. This one could even say is underrated, but either way, great Bruce. Next up is an album that I think everyone should own that has a turntable. In fact, if there's ever a reason that someone says, "Hey, why should I get a turntable?" You know, I think everything else sounds fine. Listen to this on vinyl. It's Steely Dan, Asia. Again, from top to bottom, a perfect album. Everything from Black Cow to Deacon Blues to I Got the News, Home at Last. The production on here is just unreal. It just sounds brilliant on vinyl. And, you know, I think this is the first album where they recorded the songs based on what musicians they had at the time. So if you ever see the making of this album, they used different sets of musicians for different songs, and they would try them out with different players. And, you know, there's not too much rock on here. This is a very more jazz, laid-back album as opposed to some of their earlier albums, which didn't have a lot of rock, but they still had, say, some more rock guitar on it. But I think everyone considers this probably their best album, but it's definitely not underrated, and it's definitely earns that praise. Next up is another artist where I could have picked another album, but Quadrophenia from The Who, definitely brilliant. I was possibly going to go with Who's Next, but this is probably my favorite album from them. So, and it's also not underrated, so I went with Quadrophenia. You know, I think a lot of Who albums are very polarizing. Some people like this one, some people like Who's Next, some people like Tommy as their best album. I think Tommy over the years maybe, I wouldn't say overrated, but it's definitely overplayed. They've played it in concert too much. Everything's Tommy. To me, Quadrophenia is The Who. It's a double album. Every song is killer on here. And not every song is played to death, too, on the radio and in concert. So when you listen to this album, you still are reminded of such great songs that you will hear all the time. And I know there are a lot of people that think this is their highest point their best album. So for them, I say, yeah, you're right. It's not definitely not overrated. And last album I was going to go with is by Yes, Close to the Edge. I was going to pick Fragile, Yes, but I think Close to the Edge is just such a perfect album from start to finish. Only 3 songs on it, Close to the Edge, and side 2 has And You and I, and Siberian Control. And again, I think this is a perfect album from start to finish. A lot of people, I think, pick this album as their best along or Fragile. But I think Fragile has some weaker moments. This one is just unbelievable from start to finish. It's one of those albums, if you're not even a prog fan, but if you're just a classic rock fan or a rock fan, I think you should hear this. Steve Howe's guitar playing on here is off the charts as well. Vocals. And it sounds great too. So I'll leave it at that for now. I didn't pick an album from every artist I knew. I just wanted to pick some albums here and there. So let me know what you think about some albums that aren't underrated. Some albums that you think live up to the hype. All right. Thanks a lot.